Are you treating symptoms as separate issues? Maybe you're seeing your GP for insomnia and stubborn weight gain, or maybe you've been bounced around to a cardiologist for palpitations or a psychiatrist or therapist for anxiety because your FSH looks normal, so everyone closes the case. Here's the problem in the context of perimenopause. Maybe they just caught a relatively quiet day in a system where it's anything but quiet. I'm Dr. Kinney, IFM certified functional medicine practitioner, and estrogen touches receptors across virtually every tissue in our bodies. So when its signal becomes volatile, as in perimenopause, 5 different terrains all respond at once. And that looks like 5 different diagnoses, depending on the specialty, to a model reading them in isolation. Here, I'm walking through the signs that keep getting misread and why the pattern underneath these symptoms tell a different story. Most of the time when these patients land in my office, their stories sound incredibly familiar, especially through a functional lens. They've been managing well in their lives or well enough, and then somewhere in their late 30s or mid 40s, there's a sudden shift where sleep becomes less restful, mood becomes harder to predict and regulate, and energy that used to return after a restful night's sleep gets harder and harder to access. And they do all the right things according to the books. They go to their doctor, they get their regular labs drawn, they get their referrals. What they don't get is an explanation for why they feel the way they feel. And that's not a failure of any individual clinician or specialty, but rather a structural limitation of our medical model that is designed to evaluate one signal, one symptom at a time, where you're bouncing around between cardiology, psychiatry, and your PCP, and the labs that are run there to screen for each of your symptoms come back normal because stark pathology sends very different signals, and then each one closes your case. Well, watch and wait. Each read is accurate within its own frame, but the frame itself is the problem. And it's why many of my patients slip through the cracks. Here's what this interpretation and this model cannot often see with single reads on blood markers that are looking at end-stage results. When estrogen becomes volatile, especially around perimenopause, it doesn't pick one system to disrupt at any given time. It crosses into your neurological terrain, your heart health terrain, even connective tissues, and your metabolism all simultaneously or in different combinations. So you get different readings on different instruments in different systems, and no one starts adding them up. That's the pattern that I want to walk through here. A 2023 article in the BMJ put it pretty plainly. The link to menopause may be even elusive in many individuals, meaning that clinicians themselves often fail to connect the patterns during these major shifts in hormonal terrain. And the symptoms that result remain substantially undertreated, especially at the root. Before symptoms often get unmistakable or severe enough to also flag concerns and bring someone to the hospital to begin with, there's usually a quieter opening act in perimenopause that gets misread very commonly. It often starts as shifts in the mood or energy or sleep, and these are 3 main areas that are non-specific enough to attract 3 separate explanations in the conventional space and 3 different prescriptions. An antidepressant for the mood, more caffeine for the energy or better sleep, for instance, and then a sleep aid for the rest. And each one of these interventions may help marginally, but the way I hear patients describe the effects of these different medications being stacked on oftentimes is that it's taking the edge off, or that it's 50% better or so. And the problem is that the underlying feeling, the underlying chemistry, that hormone volatility creates the sense that something in the system's baseline has shifted, and that's what is not being addressed. What surprises a lot of people too when we talk about the hormone signals of perimenopause is that perimenopause doesn't require a low estrogen state alone. The system can still be producing plenty, and especially in bursts, but what has changed oftentimes is the stability of that signal. Think of estrogen as a hormone that represents just a stable foundational floor. And this floor is something that comes into contact and constant communication with the brain and nervous system, the cardiovascular system, the joints, the gut, and each one of these environments are deeply interconnected. When that floor becomes unlevel, it has effects in the rest of the systems. You can think of estrogen as one of the greatest representations of resilience and substance in a sense as well. Estrogen provides a sort of buffering effect when it is balanced and secreted in normal rhythms. That starts to become unreliable in perimenopause, and the systems that were depending on that stable floor begin to show that strain with symptoms. This often starts happening years before anybody actually calls it perimenopause. Research looking at the hormonal turbulence during the menopausal transition found that it's not just declining estrogen that drives the disruption. It's the wide fluctuations and ups and downs of this hormone signal and the rest of the hormones that estrogen is connected to. And this fluctuation is what drives the symptoms, like vasomotor changes, the hot flashes, mood shifts, cognitive changes, and even the genitourinary changes, often simultaneously or in any combination or sequence, depending on the person and what else is going on in their systems. So again, these symptoms often land in different specialist offices, but they're coming from the same underlying source, this fluctuation and loss of stability or loss of that floor. Here's the nuance that many of these conversations often skip, is that perimenopause is much more of an instability problem than it is a stark deficiency problem when it comes to hormones. And that distinction changes everything about how you read and interpret symptoms that pop up from these systems. That's why many times, not always, when estrogen drops into a more stable lower range, when a person actually crosses over into menopause, the system does adapt after time. Something to also note is that estrogen is present in the body in extraordinarily small amounts. We're talking about a molecule that exerts its effects at concentrations measured in picograms, which is trillionths of a gram per milliliter of blood. We're talking small, small amounts. The cells and tissues that respond to it are calibrated to that level of precision. So when the signal becomes erratic, if we're talking about grains of sand in a sandbox, the downstream effects are definitely not subtle. Recent research that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine was tracking perimenopausal women and their mental health symptoms. And what they saw is that the volatility level of estrogen, or that difference in the ups and downs, is what predicted the severity of symptoms such as depression. And when progesterone dropped out of the picture as well, the effects often compounded because estrogen and progesterone have these complementary relationships in our systems. What this translates to is that many perimenopausal women that experience the mental health related symptoms, from anxiety to depression and other emotional dysregulation, often get managed as just a separate mental health concern rather than what may be connected to this hormonal terrain fluctuation. And I believe this is one of the greatest limitations of our current mental health approaches, is not truly anchoring into the changes that are going on in the chemistry that drive our thoughts and moods and set points and feelings. And by the way, if you'd like to see the research I pulled together for this video that I'm talking about, including how this volatility pattern applies to your own sequence of symptoms, there's a free research summary in the pinned comment and the description below, so check that out. And I'm curious, if you've been experiencing this shift or have gone through perimenopause as well, what's the first symptom that made you feel like something big shifted? And what did your doctor say when you brought it up? I'm curious. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one of them. So what does this start to look like when the volatility is active across multiple systems at once? The presentation can vary a lot person to person, but what comes up in my office quite regularly is something like this. A woman in her 40s or 50s, often with a high-functioning background, demanding job, family life, or similar, and she starts to notice weight that won't respond to her usual interventions, or joint discomfort that feels different from before, like she's not really able to shift into repair mode, or even brain fog that's not really tied to sleep. And usually somewhere in there, there are lab results that point to early bone density changes or heart health changes. These are all separate clinical signals from a specialist standpoint. But again, when you read them together through the lens of what estrogen provides as a buffering hormone across multiple systems, is that all of these represent a single volatility pattern underneath. Estrogen has these protective properties, including this anabolic or build-up quality when it's balanced and being well processed in the body. When that stabilizing influence becomes unreliable, that's where the inflammation changes start to occur, or the resilience factors across other systems, all the way down to the cells, up into the brain, start to come into question. They all become more apparent when that buffer is lost. And this is also where stress chemistry plays a big role. Your HPA axis, or the way your body manages stress between the brain and the adrenals, and the reproductive hormone systems are not separate. They communicate with one another. So when a woman comes to me and I hear themes of operating at very high output for years, whether professionally or in family life or beyond, with chronically elevated cortisol likely in the background, she arrives at this transition with less hormonal reserve to buffer the changes that are going on with estrogen volatility. That stage was oftentimes set years or even decades before the symptoms that are now popping up become impossible to ignore. So let's talk about the conventional line of testing, and then we'll talk a little bit about the functional line of testing when it comes to perimenopause. FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, is the marker that's most commonly used to confirm menopause and perimenopause. And it is genuinely useful information, but it's just a snapshot, and it's a representation of the way the brain is responding to the feedback loop coming from the ovaries. And what it's taking a picture of is a moving target in perimenopause. During this transition, FSH values can shift significantly from day to day, within a single cycle, and between individuals. A result that falls within the normal reference on Tuesday may be flagged as elevated on Friday. So if the time you walked into the lab to get your blood drawn happened to land on a quieter, more normal or stabilized day, the result can read as normal, and the case gets closed until sometimes a year later when you have your next visit or similar. Imagine placing your finger on a timeline and watching the data points around it, some high, some in range, some low, and one result selected at random is what determines where you fall. This is why I often rely in the functional space on Dutch testing with cycle mapping, tools that track hormone levels across an entire 28 to 35 day cycle, and their metabolites show the way that your body's actually breaking down and using hormones. They often reveal what a single FSH reading cannot. They show how the hormone signals change over time, how the breakdown and detoxification pathways are functioning, and how surrounding hormones like progesterone and testosterone and cortisol are also shifting in relationship to the changes in estrogen. That relational picture changes what interventions make sense oftentimes, as well as the timing. It also shifts the way that we start to question what's happening around hormones. Rather than asking, is there enough estrogen present in the blood, and stopping there, we start to look at how it's being used, how it's being broken down. What does your processing chemistry look like? And what is your tissue actually being exposed to across an average day, across an average cycle? These are all factors that can influence how estrogen, even in its tiny, tiny picogram amounts, exerts itself and its effects over multiple systems and tissues. And the reason why this questioning matters to not only my patients, but myself as a clinician, is that we're trying to escape the world of diagnosis alone. We're changing the frame about how you read yourself and the nuance of things like hormonal signals. So if you've been feeling like you're just going in circles, interpreting your symptoms as 5 separate problems because 5 separate specialists each assessed one piece that get 5 different prescriptions, you've been doing the only thing that our current medical model has made available to you. So when we start to turn this frame on its head, and rather than tamping down symptoms, we're understanding what's creating symptoms, and you understand that estrogen volatility is a systemic disruption event with a sequence in multiple systems, two big things start to change. First, the question changes. Instead of asking, what symptoms do I try and manage next, you start asking, what does my hormone chemistry look like across my cycle? How is it being processed? And which surrounding hormones are also shifting in ways that compound the picture. And second is the threshold for investigation changes. Conventional testing is largely designed to identify end-stage pathological dysfunction patterns, markers that are calibrated to catch what has already tipped into disease states. Good functional testing is calibrated completely differently. It reads the spectrum between optimal function and dysfunction or pathology. And it does so with enough sensitivity to see what's happening before the scale tips to the far end of pathology. The goal is to read the pattern in the terrain early enough and sensitively enough so that the loss of resilience across multiple systems doesn't compound for a decade before anyone puts the dots together. So by now we've established that perimenopause is the result of hormonal volatility, especially as it relates to estrogen. Many times my patients going through perimenopause also see that they have some deep nervous system work to go through alongside them. And that's exactly what this video covers here. So check it out. I'm Dr. Kenny, Root Cause Help Detective. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.